towards integrated interpretation. So by integrated interpretation, first of all, what do I mean? I mean simply bringing together all the multidisciplinary data we have at our disposal into a single, consistent model that we can use for whatever our business purposes are, although our main one, not our only one at MIRA Geoscience, but our main one is exploration targeting, and that's what I'll be talking about today. How to build a model out of geophysical, geological, geochemical, petrophysical data that is consistent, the best possible model you can make for exploration targeting. So I show this slide as really motivational. It's a conceptual slide, but it really shows what we want to do. We want to target a drill hole based on a model, and we want to do it in a quantitative way, meaning that we want that model to be a quantitative representation of all the data that we have going into it, the geological data, geochemical data, structural data, etc. And by bringing all that data together into a single self-consistent model, which I'll talk a bit about in more detail later, we're going to generate the best possible drill hole targets. So as a group at MIRA Geoscience, we're involved not only in the modeling, but also in the targeting. Today I'll be talking mostly about the modeling itself. But once you have that model, of course, how you best target it is another very interesting question, and I'll say a little bit about that, which is largely an R&D subject for us, but it's one that we're intensely interested in, and one, again, that I'll say a little bit more about. As a company, we're involved not only in mineral exploration, but also other geoscience businesses where we're trying to bring together lots of different data streams into a single model that we can act upon in an optimal way. So our other major line of business, aside from mineral exploration, is geotechnical hazard assessment. And in geotechnical hazard assessment, what we're trying to do is assess where and when on the mine geotechnical hazards are most likely to occur. Geotechnical hazards can come in many forms. They can be rock bursts, roof falls, floods. There are many things that can happen in both underground and open pit mines. And understanding when and where they're most likely to happen is, of course, very important. I think you can also see from the picture and from the equation suggested there that it's a very analogous subject to mineral exploration targeting. It's not the 3D volumetric problem we have in mineral exploration targeting. It's a problem where we're trying to estimate various model criteria on the mine infrastructure, and then rather than target a mineral exploration target, we're trying to target the geotechnical hazard. So how do these different quantities, whether it's geology, rock quality, structure, seismicity, stress, whatever, how do these different properties of the earth and of the mine model coalesce on the mine infrastructure in a way that we can use to best assess where geotechnical hazards will come? So we're really taking the same base technologies, the same foundation of earth modeling, and the same approach to integrated interpretation for both those problems, even though I'll say very little more about the geotechnical problem today because I know this group is mostly focused on mineral exploration. I will say one other thing though. The mineral exploration target is 3D while the geotech problem is 4D, because many of the data streams that we have on the geotechnical hazard assessment problem are changing in time. So rather than trying to understand, again, where a target will be in a 3D volume, we're trying to understand where a target, a geotechnical hazard target, will be on the mine infrastructure. So it's not quite 3D in the same way, but it has a time component, which makes it an interesting and complex problem. And we're using really case studies and work we're doing with customers on both the mineral exploration and the geotechnical hazard assessment to kind of feed off each other in terms of how we think about technology development, our approach to integrated interpretation, and how we put it all together using the same sort of base processes, concepts, and technologies. A lot of our work in integrated interpretation, how we bring together particularly geological, geophysical, and petrophysical data, was motivated from what they learned in the petroleum industry a couple of decades ago. So going back to the 1980s in the oil and gas industry, they were facing difficult technical challenges, unconventional plays, deep plays. Exploration became something that had to be quantitatively driven, not just spotting wells. It had to be very science-based. And I really think we're at about the same point now in the mineral exploration industry, even though it's a couple of decades on, or maybe 3 decades on, from when they ran into this issue in the petroleum industry. We're really at that point now. In mineral exploration, people talk all the time now about the necessity of deep search, exploration undercover. The thought being, of course, that there's still big deposits out there to find, but the big deposits out there that were easy to find have largely been found, and now the exploration game gets a little bit tougher. So the question that we ask ourselves in mineral exploration is really the same kind of question that they had to ask themselves again 20 or 30 years ago on the oil side, how you take geological, geophysical, and petrophysical data, bring them together to get the best possible model upon which your exploration targeting is based. This article here from First Break, a geophysical journal you'll be familiar with, or many of you will be familiar with, is from 1997, so it's 20 years old. They talk about the common Earth model here as a concept. We've latched onto that term. It's from the oil and gas industry. This paper was from people at Chevron. But we've latched onto it because we really think that the objective we have in integrated interpretation is exactly what they were facing. And really, even though the workflows are slightly different and the data sets are slightly different, what we're trying to achieve is conceptually exactly the same. So we really use a lot of this early work in the oil and gas business as not only motivational, but we pay attention to what they actually did, and we try to replicate some of those same processes in mineral exploration. Model-based, that's critical. If you're going to bring your data together for targeting, it has to be done through a model. I'll say a bit more about that later, but I think most of you understand that anyway, particularly for geophysical data. If we're going to be looking deep search and undercover, we have to get away from geophysical data towards models. Those are petrophysical models based on geophysical data and geological data. The point about validation being essential was a point that was raised and underlined in this paper from 20 years ago and others. It's an extremely important point. Models must be validated as a first step to understanding, are they reasonable? We know our models aren't correct, but too often still in the mineral exploration industry, our models are not even reasonable in the sense that they cannot be validated by the very data upon which they're based. So what we've learned, we've been at this for 17 years. MIRA Geoscience has been around. We've been really following this same path, trying to learn those lessons from the oil and gas industry and bring our data together in an integrated interpretation. What we've learned is really summarized simply on that slide. First of all, it can't be a black box. It's multidisciplinary. It's always interpretive. Our models are always under-constrained. We always have to bring our geoscientific reasoning into the model. Geoscientific judgment is more important than the computational details. In other words, there's lots of ways of getting at these models. There are lots of details and differences, or differences in details of how inversion is done, how geological modeling is done, how different types of analysis are done. The geoscientific judgment is much more important. You can get to a reasonable model using many different tools. The right tools are important, though, but the judgment is more important. The right team is important to make those judgments. This cannot be done by an individual. That is one thing that we've absolutely learned. And that's also a lesson that the oil and gas industry learned when they formed asset teams back, again, 20 or 30 years ago, making sure that every project had a team that embodied geological, geophysical, and petrophysical experience on the same team, building that model upon which their targeting was based. They learned that a culture change is required to break sequential workflows. I imagine that's true in the mineral industry as well. I don't think we're quite there. We're still using a lot of sequential workflows as opposed to this iterative process of having the multidisciplinary team together creating the model. We've also learned that formal planning is required to build the model. Something that we learned a long time ago, and we've been in the 3D modeling business for a long time, as I say, is that a lot of people, when building a 3D model, build the 3D model without carefully thinking through exactly what they're going to do with it. And understanding exactly why you're making the model and tying that back specifically to data sets and what you're going to do to those data sets is critically important. We learned again a long time ago that it's just too easy to start importing data into a 3D program and looking at things visually, quickly creating surfaces, doing inversions. All of those things that are now fairly easy to do, it's a mistake. It's a mistake to do those things without a firm objective in mind and taking that objective back through the process to the data sets you're going to use, how you're going to use them, exactly what you're going to do with them, how are you going to tie them together. And what we've done is we've really formalized that, and I'm talking today about the specific workflows, but we've really formalized that to a point where you convert that conceptual thinking of what you're going to do and how you're going to reach your business objective into a series of fairly mechanical steps. It's still an iterative process, and it's still interpretational all the way, but you have to build a series of steps. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right to the end of the process from data import to target. And if you're not doing that, you really should think about what you might get out of the process of forcing yourself to do that kind of planning. Do a lot of work on paper, really, before you ever turn the computer on. Very important. Where are we going? In terms of the company, we're still pursuing hard integrated interpretation. And that's led us to these 3 key areas. And we're doing separate things in each of these areas. The first is planning and data management. So I mentioned planning a minute ago on the last slide. Now we're starting to create formal software tools to help us through that planning. We did it a lot on paper and through Excel at first. And now we're creating tools in software that connect right to the modeling process. The integrated interpretation and validation itself, so that's the model construction and validation, and in a few minutes I'll take you through a couple of examples of that just to give you a sense of it and how we're doing it. And then finally, the communication, collaboration, and analysis. How do we get the results out to our colleagues, to our customers in our case often? How do we communicate what we've done? As I mentioned previously, you need a team. You need a team with the right judgments, and those teams have to work together on the models. So we've really worked hard to build those skilled, multidisciplinary teams. And we're doing it, as a company, as it says there, to deliver software, training, workshops, consulting services. But in building those teams, we're really thinking of, if we were an exploration company ourselves, what kind of team would we need internally, with what skill sets and what tools to do the kind of integrated interpretations leading towards the best exploration drill hole targets we can find. So those are the teams that we're building internally within our company so that we understand the process, and then we can work with customers to either deliver them technology and train them in it so they can do it themselves, or we can do any part of it or all of it for them, depending on what their requirements are. So just a few words about how we go about the process of integrated interpretation. And conceptually, it's actually fairly simple. First of all, I'll tell you about what we're trying not to do, which I think is still pretty much the state of the art as practiced throughout most of the industry. We're trying not to do what's pictured here. And what's pictured here are two unconnected processes, or two quantitatively unconnected processes, even if in the end they're visually connected. On the top, we have inversion. So inversion came along in the minerals industry 20-odd years ago, and it's gotten pretty fast, and it's gotten pretty good, and we can invert pretty much any geophysical data set there is in either 2D or 3D. It started with potential fields, but now not only electrical, but also complex electromagnetic data sets can be inverted in 3D, and they can be inverted relatively fast. So that inversion process is pictured conceptually up there by showing a magnetic data set. That's that image in the upper left part of the slide. And what we do when we invert data is we apply a series of equations, such as shown in the top center there, to that magnetic data set or whatever geophysical data set, and we convert that data into a physical property model. So the physical property model shown at top right is a 3D volume of magnetic susceptibilities. And if you forward model that, so if you figure out computationally what magnetic data set you would collect if you collected one over a magnetic susceptibility distribution, as shown by that inversion model, you would get exactly that. So what we've done is simply convert magnetic data to a physical property model. And the key thing here is that this is an unconstrained inversion, and an unconstrained inversion uses a series of weights. And you can kind of see a few of them there in that fragment of the equation you see in the box. There's some alphas, there's some W's there that are weighting functions. These weights are typically set to default values, although they can be adjusted. And the key point, though, is that however they're set, whether they're adjusted by the user or left as defaults, they control the shape and form of the susceptibility distribution that comes out the other end. Okay? So it's not really a geological process. Typically, these weights are set in a sensible way by the creators of the inversion codes to properly handle depth weighting and smoothness. But the point is that even though that magnetic susceptibility distribution that comes out of the inversion process is consistent with the magnetic data that went into it, it's just one of an infinite number of magnetic susceptibility models that would be consistent with it. That's the non-uniqueness problem. And in particular, it's a smooth model, and it doesn't look geological. It doesn't look geological because it's not geologically realistic. We know a priori that physical properties in the Earth are mostly controlled by discontinuities at structural breaks and formational boundaries. Physical properties in the Earth are not smooth. Unconstrained inversions deliver smooth models. At the bottom, we have, for the same area, a geological process in which we're going from geological data on the left, so map contacts, perhaps drill hole data, structural measurements, through, in this case, as I pictured it, through an implicit modeling algorithm. Those are radial basis functions shown in a little snippet in that bottom box. And out at the bottom right comes a geological model. It's a similar sort of process. Data, equations with a lot of weights, model out. The model that comes out, whether it's on the top or bottom, whether it's a geological or geophysical model, is just one of many, many models that are consistent with the data. So what comes out of this typical process, as we employ it still today in mineral exploration, are two different models, each of them consistent with a single data set. Both models are non-unique representations of that single data set, and the process through which those two models were created, even though it's the same piece of ground, are entirely disconnected. Okay, so on the bottom, we have a picture of the geology that's saying we expect that the Earth is broken into a series of rocks And those rocks are separated by discontinuities, and we're going to model those discontinuities as surfaces. And whether it's through an implicit modeler as shown here, or it's done through explicitly modeled wireframes, it's a series of discontinuous surfaces. And at top, we're saying the exact opposite. We're saying we expect no discontinuities in the model. We expect that the Earth is smooth, and we're going to represent it as a smoothly varying physical property distribution. So this is what I mean by not integrated interpretation. And what we're going to try to do with integrated interpretation is connect these things. So when I ask the question, what is the connection? The connection, of course, really is physical properties, right? Because the geophysical data responds only to physical property variation. And the geological data is really a model of geological surfaces, formational contact, lithological and structural surfaces, most of which are surfaces across which there's a discontinuity in physical properties. So physical properties form the connection between geology and geophysics. I think we all know that conceptually. The issue is, how do you actually do it? How do you make this work? How do you come out with a single model that's consistent with both input data sets, the geological and the geophysical, and at the same time is consistent with geological conceptual understanding and is petrophysically realistic? That's what an integrated interpretation is quantitatively, and that's the kind of model that we want to make upon which to base our drill hole targets. So our approach is actually very simple. It's simple conceptually, but in practice, it's not trivially easy to do. Well, it's not that hard to do either. There's no real reason why people shouldn't be doing it. And I'll show another example of this in a moment, but just on one slide here, you can see on the top right, you've got a magnetic data set. And the approach here is to take whatever map data we may have and whatever geophysical interpretation we're doing of a magnetic coverage, say, or it could be a gravity coverage or both. And what we're showing here is that there's an interpretation, a line work on a mag map, and those arrows just indicating an assumed direction of dip. And just from that basic data, just looking at the mag data, looking at some geological contacts, getting an idea, a conceptual idea at first of just what's going on in the subsurface, what's causing the responses that we see. And so our approach then is to start just constructing a model. And we construct a model in many different ways, so there's no simple recipe for this. But the first step is to construct a starting model. So how you do that depends upon individual data sets and individual projects. And here we're just showing it sort of conceptually through a simple example where we isolate one anomaly, which is that sort of red anomaly you see where the arrows are drawn on the top right image. That magnetic data is shown just to the lower left of it in a kind of 3D perspective of the magnetic data showing the magnetic high. And then we start just constructing a simple model. Well, let's just take a dipping slab. You know, that's what's indicated by that magnetic anomaly. So we construct it, and of course it generates something when we forward model it that looks vaguely like the magnetic anomaly, but it's not right in detail. So then we go through an approach of taking that initial starting geological model, which again can come from many different sources. Again, we sometimes use unconstrained inversions to suggest that starting model in conjunction with the geological mapping. But we get a starting model, and then we start modifying it. And the goal of modifying it repeatedly is iteratively keep modifying that model, attributing it with physical properties until it matches the geophysical data and the geological data. So at every step in that iteration, we're staying true to the geological data, but we're also modifying things to better match the geophysical data. So we'll do things like a geometry correction. And for that, we're using our software VPMG, which can take geophysical data and directly start moving the structures around, really take a geological wireframe and alter the geometry of that wireframe so it better matches the geophysical data. So a simple geometry correction is shown there, and you can see right away that we're better matching the anomaly. And then we go from there to filling out the 3D volume with physical properties, in this case, magnetic susceptibility. But you can see that the magnetic susceptibility in the model at the lower right is primarily controlled by individual geological bodies and only secondarily by heterogeneity of the physical property within those bodies. And that is by and large, a starting assumption we typically have. In the absence of any other information, we'll always take that assumption that physical properties in the Earth are primarily controlled by discontinuities at structures or geological contacts, and secondarily by heterogeneities within those bodies. Another example, just to make that a bit more concrete, this was done by my colleague Glenn Pears in our Brisbane office. This is looking undercover at some simple magnetic data, a very little bit of drilling. There are 7 drill holes here, and some high-resolution mag data, trying to understand what's happening. So on the left there, you see the mag data, and the process here, again, is pretty simple. We start by taking the magnetic data to do basic geological interpretation. It's undercover. We don't have any geological map. So we create the line work that we think may correspond to the geological contacts and structures based on the magnetic map. And then we do some basic parametric modeling. As you can see on the top right, we build in 3D some of those structures, and then we have tools to build these bodies quickly, and then we start varying their dip, in this case, to understand what their dip may be. And with each step change in the dip, we're forward modeling, always forward modeling. You can forward model rapidly. Forward model to compare it to the data. Forward model to compare the data. Change again, forward model to compare to the data. We do a lot more forward modeling than we do inversion. And following that, we end up with an understanding of the dip, and we have the line work at left, and we build a basic geological model, a geological wireframe model based only on an understanding of magnetic data. We take that model, and then we look at it volumetrically. And again, our first step is to always assume, until proven otherwise, that individual geological units tend to be homogeneous with primary physical property differences occurring across boundaries. So in this case, we have only, I believe it's 5 units there, and you can see that at left. So very simple model, each of those 5 units having a different magnetic susceptibility. And look at the magnetic data. At the top, you have the observed magnetic data, and at the bottom, you have the calculated magnetic data. So I think that's quite impressive, right? With just those simple 5 domains that were interpreted from the magnetic data, just basic aeromagnetic interpretation, and then looking at dips in 3D, attributing them with susceptibilities, we created a unit with 5 perfectly homogeneous domains, and you can see how closely we match the data. So this is our approach, and this is our approach to integrated interpretation. Of course, the details, again, always vary by project, but the overall approach is as simple as what's represented in that slide. Start with the basic data, geological data and drilling data if you have it, geophysical data if you have it, and you construct a 3D model of homogeneous domains that as nearly matches the geophysical and geological data as you possibly can. Okay? And once you have it that close, then in a secondary inversion step, you can allow or admit heterogeneity within those domains. And in doing that, you have a much firmer grasp or grip on what's going on in the subsurface, because now you're looking at something that's logical, geologically logical. You're looking at structural discontinuities. You're looking at formational discontinuities. And then after explaining most of the geophysical data that way, you finally admit the heterogeneity required to satisfy all of the details in the geophysical data. And in doing so, you're getting down to understanding how the very subtle variations in your geophysical data, in an example like this, even undercover, can reveal things like alteration complexes within formations. And you cannot do that unless you've already explained the major causes of the geophysical responses, which are the structural breaks and the formational volumetric geometries. This is a very important point for us, and this is a very active area of investigation for us internally and in some of the research projects we're involved in. How can you best interpret alteration signatures from geophysical data? Because there's nothing like a well-interpreted alteration signature to help you with your exploration targeting. And if you're looking at alteration through geophysics, you must first account for the structural complexity, structural breaks, and the formational domains that are the primary control of the geophysical response. And once you've taken care of that, you can only then start to look at how alteration itself may be causing the remaining residuals in your geophysical response. So we get a final picture like that, and at this point, we can start to make direct interpretations of alteration undercover. Again, from only 7 drill holes and 1 aeromagnetic data set. And without this integrated interpretation paradigm, this thinking through of the process, forcing always geological hypotheses, validated iteratively by a series of forward models, can you get to the point where you finally, through inversion in the final instance, start to look for alteration through a geophysical signature. So in doing that, you have to have the right team, and this is something that we're really proud of at MIRA Geoscience. Even through the last few years of the downturn, we've managed to continue adding to our team, and we think we've got a very well-rounded team, virtual team. This team's not all in one office, but we work together across our offices, and we bring very high-level expertise in all of these different individual disciplines to individual projects. And as I said earlier, we've done this thinking about, if we were a mineral exploration company, what kind of expertise do we need to bring together as an asset team to work on individual projects, and then try to replicate that within the company. On the software side, we're software and a consulting company, but really we're a solution company that's trying to do integrated interpretation for drill hole targeting and geotechnical hazard assessment. And so we frame everything around that. Not only what team do we need, but also what tools do we need. And the tools we create are the tools that we need to have an ecosystem that team can deploy. And we don't go out and create tools that already exist and that people already have. If that's the case, we'll just use those tools. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we have a software offering that is a mix of our own software and in some cases software such as GOCAD that we're resellers of, but we add on to because it's from the oil and gas industry and it's made for integrated interpretation for common Earth model creation, and we've adapted it to the mining world. But we've also created 2 other pieces of software that are just sort of on the verge of coming out. Geoscience Analyst actually was released last year, and Geoscience INTEGRATOR is just sort of coming out now. But going back to what I said at the beginning, those 3 different areas, managing the data, organizing the inputs, integrated interpretation and communication, collaboration, and analysis, we've really designed 3 pieces of software around those very things. So Geoscience Integrator actually has an interesting story. Its roots came out of our geotechnical business. We did a lot of data management work for Rio Tinto on the geotechnical side several years ago, and through that we built up a data management capability and group. And then again, through the mining and geotechnical side, we built a very robust data management system for underground mining, specifically for geotechnical hazard assessment. And we're just in the process now through the Footprints project, which I'll say a bit more about in a few minutes, adapting it to exploration. But really it's a system for managing data and managing models, tracking models, and then eventually tracking targets. Integrated interpretation, the 3D model, we do that in SKUA-GOCAD, again, just because it's built for exactly that. And Geoscience Analyst, I think many of you know it. It's been out for a year. It's a free product. You can download it from our website. The idea is really to democratize the communication of 3D models. So it's an extremely powerful 3D visualizer. But it's not a lockdown system to any specific software platform. It's completely open. You can import data from anything, and you can add to it. And you can't build a model in it, but you can bring model components into it from anywhere, put them all together, add notes to it, add files to it, add documents to it, and then distribute it to whoever you like. So that's a free piece of software that you can download from our website, and that's been out for about a year. We're starting to add some tools to that as well. Just I think tomorrow we're releasing a Drillhole designer and a link to IO gas for that, and we'll start adding some paid modules to that. But fundamentally, it's a free 3D visualization and communication platform. Just a few words on each of those platforms. Geoscience Integrator, again, really built in the first case for our geotechnical hazard assessment business, as suggested by the picture at bottom. But the reason it had to be built was because geotechnical hazard assessment is a real-time problem. It's not a take it away, do a consulting project problem. It's a problem of time-dependent data streams being brought together at a mine site to in real time compute geotechnical hazard assessments and how they're changing on the mine. You can't do that without a data management system, and that's what we built this for. Can manage 4D data, as many of them are on the mine site, tie it together with all these things you're seeing here, and then it connects it to machine learning to do the geotechnical hazard assessment and spits out reports. So that's the one that we're just in the process now of adding exploration themes to. GOCAD mining suite, again, built expressly for the integrated interpretation I'm talking about. And I think it's still, I mean, this isn't true on the oil and gas side, but on the mining side, I think it's still the only application out there for which geology or geophysics don't have any primacy. We need all your data. We're building a model that's truly an integrated interpretation. And again, we can do that because that concept and how to funnel data through all those workflows came directly from the oil and gas industry. So even though the data sets and the workflows are slightly different, we use it for the same purpose. And interestingly, our partner Paradigm, who owns SKUA-GOCAD and for which we are resellers of to the mining industry, and ourselves have really been working on the last few months to put together a rebundling that's much more highly tailored to the integrated interpretation we need to do in mining. So if you look particularly at the third column, these are our new bundles that are coming out, so stay tuned for that, with really radically lowered pricing for the mining industry as well. That was part of what we've tried to do. If you look at particularly the middle column there, you'll see you have the structural implicit modeling combined with the geophysics. And that's the idea. You want to be able to build those models iteratively and at every step, forward model, forward model, forward model. So you have everything you need in terms of the geostatistics to attribute things petrophysically quickly after you've done another iteration of the geological modeling, and then quickly forward model and see what needs to be changed. So really geared specifically and designed around this integrated interpretation workflow that we've been thinking about for so many years. We're very excited about that. And then Geoscience Analyst, which I just said a few words about, also connects to the data management system, but that is just, again, an extremely powerful visualizer that if you haven't seen it or used it already, I encourage you to take a look. Absolutely free, just download it from our website. And the reason for that, again, is we realize that actually doing integrated interpretation not only takes a team, but it takes skill. You got to learn software. You have to, you know, the kind of people that are in this room can all do that or learn how to do that. If they're not doing it already, it's not that tough, but it's still something that you need to be doing. Like that's a job, doing that integrated interpretation. It's not just a hobby. What we realize is that in terms of sort of consuming those models that are being produced by those teams, there are many, many more people who need to consume those models, to interpret them, to spot drill holes based on them, to communicate around them. And that's why we created Analyst. So to understand and use 3D models, you don't need a 3D modeling platform. That's why you're not creating the model here. You're bringing it in here, and you're communicating with your colleagues. But a very powerful. I'm not sure how long it took us to figure that out. It seems obvious now in retrospect, but so many users of 3D modeling software are not actually making 3D models. They're looking at 3D models that other people made, and that's the point of this. So if that's all you're doing, why do you have to spend all this money on complicated software with 1 million buttons in it and lots of menus when you really just want to kind of look at things and interpret it? We, as a group, are very focused on development, not only of technology, but also of process and understanding geoscience and the workflows around how to better interpret geoscientific data. So we're very connected to our R&D world. These are the projects that we're currently working on as a company. In almost all cases with others. Mining Observatory Data Control Center. This is a facility being built in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, as effectively a data center for machine learning and analytics, data QA, QC, data management, everything around data, not modeling per se, but everything around data. And it's actually not just for geoscience, but it's for mining. So it includes things like maintenance and process and geometallurgy. But we're heavily involved in that on the data management and the geoscience side. Ultra-deep mining network. We're working on a major project with a so-called Network Center of Excellence in Canada called the Ultra-Deep Mining Network on 4D real-time geotechnical hazard assessment. I said we're already doing it. We're trying to do it better, and we're trying to do it better using predictive analytics and machine learning so that we have what we call a real learning system. So as new data is collected on the mine model automatically updates. And as every day goes by on the mine, you have incidents or you don't have incidents. And if you have incidents, they happen somewhere. You have data. So every day that goes by, there's learning to be done. Right? It was a good day, it was a bad day, it was some kind of day, there was new data. That data is all coming into the data management system. So part of what we're doing in this project is to create a real automated learning system so that the statistical relationships amongst the different data sets and the history of ground control incidents can be can evolve in time as we have each new day's data. Canadian Mining Innovation Council. This is the Footprints project. It actually has a super long, unwieldy title. We just call it Footprints. It's the ... really goes on for another probably dozen words, but we just call it Footprints, and we're heavily involved in this project as well. This was up till now, and only just recently superseded by another one, the largest mineral exploration research project ever in Canada. I think there are 24 universities involved, multi-million dollar project. And what's happening in this project is that they have 3 different models, and they're trying to use machine learning to better understand what the footprint of the deposit is, and are there ways you can recognize it using combinations of data that haven't been really perceived before, right out to the most distal part of the alteration complex. I'll say a few more words about that in a moment. Mineral exploration simulator called MinSim is a project we've been working on for a couple of years as well. The purpose there is to be able to play what-if games with mineral exploration hypotheses. So you build a detailed, say, camp scale model of an area, and you do it in such a way that it matches all of the real existing data, matches the drilling, matches the geological map, matches the structural matches the geophysical data. So it's a real integrated interpretation on a camp scale in which you can now play some games. You can, for example, emplace mineral deposits of a certain size at a certain depth, certain characteristics, and see, are they detectable in geophysical data? If you flew a hypothetical airborne gravity survey over it, would you see a signature? How deep does it have to be before the signature disappears in the correct sort of geological noise or geological environment? Okay? What is your exploration strategy for that deposit? Or will your current exploration strategy work? And then finally, one that's specifically on machine learning. I won't go into detail on that, but that's a major topic. I said at the beginning we were doing a lot of work on the targeting part of it. A lot of that is through machine learning, but that's not the major topic of my talk today. I did want to say a few words about the Footprints project, though, because it's such a big Canadian research project right now. The hypotheses of the project are written there. I won't read them out. But really what they're trying to do is take very robust data sets that go right from superficial geochemistry to whole rock geochemistry to mineral chemistry to mineralogy to geophysical data, petrophysical data, structural you name it, very detailed studies of 3 case study sites, and to take these voluminous data sets and try to tease out relationships that haven't previously been seen in order to see if there are spatially locatable or identifiable zones of that footprint to say this is, you know, zone A and it has this sort of characteristic statistically, and this is zone B and zone C. And we're all used to conceptual models of ore deposits with, you know, the cartoons with the different zones around them. This is an attempt to see through evidence, are there spatial zonations that we haven't been able to see before, and do they have a relationship or a hierarchy amongst themselves that will enable us, if we're able to recognize them in the field, to vector towards the core of the mineralized system. That's the purpose. It's a very interesting project. We're halfway through year 4 of the 5-year project. It's broken into many different modules. I'm a co-leader of the data integration module, which has its own specific objectives. And in this case, it very much mimics what we're trying to do as a company anyway in exploration, which is why we're involved in it, how to manage multidisciplinary exploration data towards integrated interpretation, how to represent that data through 3D models. And it has to be represented through 3D models. And the reason it has to be represented through 3D models is primarily geophysical. It's because geophysics data is the best of all in terms of regular coverage over a large area. And geophysical data cannot be interpreted properly without building a 3D model for the reasons I said earlier, because what we really in the end want to interpret from the geophysical data in this context are alteration signatures, and you have no hope of interpreting subtle alteration signatures if you don't go through that 3D modeling integrated interpretation process. How to represent those 3D models to machine learning, that's a very interesting and complex subject in itself. You can't just take data and chuck it in. You have to, I'll just say, think it through. And then how do you use the machine learning to try to understand, in the first instance, can you recognize those zones I talked about that make up the architecture of the ore system? And in the second instance, how could you recognize those zones in field data? How could you recognize it with a minimal amount of data and with the cheapest possible sources of data? And then finally, if you're able to do that, in the best case, this is the hoped-for outcome of the project, we'll find new ways of vectoring towards the core of the system based on that. Just a quick word on how we translate the 3D model to the machine learning, and it's conceptually, again, as with many of these things, conceptually they're easy and the devil's all in the details, but CEM means Common Earth Model, so what information does it contain? And that cartoon shows that we have wireframes representing structures, we have wireframes representing contacts, we have the yellow dots there showing that's surficial geochemistry or soil samples, the blue dots are drill hole samples, the red dots are centroids of grid cells from an inversion, perhaps a magnetic inversion, and the green dots are centroids of perhaps a 3D induced polarization inversion. Doesn't matter. The point is that we have wireframe surfaces in 3D and we have points in 3D, and that's what we have to work with. And at the points we have properties, and we have properties that we also calculate from the model, like proximity to major structures or things like that. But at the very end of the day, what we have is what's written at the bottom of the screen. We have X, Y, Z, property 1, property 2, property N. In the footprints project, we have a lot of data sets. The number of properties is often over 100. And the number of points is often well over 1 million. So that is the data set that gets sent to the machine learning algorithm. It really comes down to basically an ASCII file that looks like that on the bottom, X, Y, Z, properties, times 1 million or more rows. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to take that data file of those observations, which end up being point observations or are converted to point observations, and ask that question: are there patterns amongst those properties that enable us to group observations in a meaningful way? Those are the sort of zones I was talking about in a cartoon form. And if we're able to isolate points and say, yeah, these cluster in a certain zone, zone C, then the next question, how do we identify zone C in field data optimally? And the question following that, if we can, how do we vector towards A, the core? And I'll just mention this in closing, or almost in closing. I mentioned that the Footprints project was, until today, the largest mineral exploration research project in Canada, but there's a new one which is even bigger. We're lucky to be involved in this one as well. It's called Metal Earth, and while the Footprints project was really focused around individual mineral deposit footprints, the Metal Earth project is really asking a different question. Its fundamental scientific question is how do we recognize belts or districts that will have higher metal endowment, and why? Right? So if you look in an area like the Canadian Shield, the Precambrian Craton, it has many greenstone belts. Some of those greenstone belts are very well endowed with both gold and base metals, others with one or the other, and yet others with neither. Yet superficially, all of those greenstone belts seem very similar. So the question is why? So the Metal Earth project it's obviously a high budget project. A lot of that money is going to geophysical data acquisition because they're asking sort of big, deep questions. So there'll be a lot of seismic and magnetotelluric data and potential field data in addition to new geological mapping. And we're not sure yet exactly where that project's going any more than I just told you, but MIRA Geoscience is involved in it at the outset on the data integration side, the data management, modeling, analysis, same as we were in the Footprints project, just this time at a different scale. So we're pretty excited about that. So in closing, towards integrated interpretation, it will happen. It is happening. We know companies are doing it. They're doing it without us. In many cases, in some cases, they're doing it with us. It's what we love doing and love innovating in. We are certain that the drivers that existed going back to the 1980s in the oil and gas business are conceptually very similar to the drivers that are forcing us into the deep search, undercover. You got to do it better. You got to do it quantitatively mindset that the oil industry faced. Technology, methods, culture are all evolving to meet that challenge, and we're very happy to be part of that. And for us, it means we're growing and thrilled to. We're very heavily invested in R&D, most of it not internally focused, as I explained, most of it in collaboration with others, often with academics, sometimes with other companies, and growing to build that team of both technologists who can write code and create the tools we need, but also, and I think more importantly, the geoscience expertise it takes to come together as a team to solve that integrated interpretation problem, because that's what it takes. Well, thank you very much.